OK, so I'm going to talk about inequality, privacy, and digital market design. This is a set of ideas that were developed with my frequent co-author, Catherine Tucker. We've been thinking about privacy for a while. The inequality and digital market design aspects are new maybe this month. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So I actually started when they said, well, let's talk about inequality, digital, and market design. I started with my own research on digital and inequality, which is probably why I was invited here in the first place. And then, and so we have this digital divide. We have individuals, high income, educated urbanites, have adopted the internet earlier and at higher rates. Urban businesses in high income, high education locations tend to adopt first, and then once they adopt, they tend to use it better. And we see something very similar in the hospital context. Urban hospitals that are in high income counties tend to benefit the most from the internet. And so I thought, OK, well, let's think about, now we have two of the three pieces. We have digital, we have market design, digital inequality. Let's think about the market design aspect. And then I tried to think about, well, when we look at that research and we try to think about market failures, the market failures were less obvious. So essentially, if there are any market failures driving the digital divide, which is still a controversial statement, I don't think it's obvious, it's around weak education or it's around competition. And so education seemed like other people in this room would be better at thinking about market design for education than me. So I'm going to leave that aside. And then on competition, that's a more standard set of I/O tools in telecom to try and think about competition issues. And once again, I thought, well, maybe this isn't the right audience to talk about that. So I decided to think about a different source of digital inequality that has gotten a lot less attention, but I think it's really important. And this is around the market for data. Okay, so everything that occurs online is easily recorded, stored, and analyzed. The digital economy is in many ways based. What's Google and Facebook's business model? It's based on the collection, storage, and analysis of the data they have. Companies and governments observe these actions at a detailed level, and this means that all of us are of sufficient commercial interest that it's worth tracking us. So when privacy regulations and privacy discussions happened 20 or more years ago, when people talked about privacy, they talked about privacy from government, from police, fundamentally, and they talked about the privacy of public figures and the division between being a public figure and a private figure and what that meant in terms of what was allowed to be talked about you in the paper. But now we're all of enough interest that from the point of view of a company, we're all worth collecting data about. Okay, so this is now something that went from a market that we might think about in terms of media and public figures to a more general market for data. Now, how do we think about designing a market for data? So at the policy level, the core aspect to think about designing a market for data is privacy regulation. Right? And the existing policy discussion, just importantly, does not talk about inequality. Sometimes it shows up implicitly here or there, but the policy discussion around privacy is really about a desire to ensure that personal information flows in accordance with expectations. Okay? And so there's a challenge in defining expectations, a challenge in defining what companies and governments should say those expectations are, and then how do we ensure that companies and governments follow the rules or that they said they were going to follow. So the key challenge, though, understanding why this is an interesting or a different market design problem and an interesting and challenging policy problem is that digital information is non-rivalrous. Right? So whenever information is created and shared, it is free to then share it with anybody else. Right? Especially in the digital form, there's no deterioration. At least with gossip, then each stage it gets worse and worse, perhaps. But with digital information, you have perfect fidelity in terms of that sharing. So that means that digital information biases toward openness. And let's be clear, openness is usually something we think about as a good value. So digital information biases toward openness, and this makes it difficult to restrict the flow of information without explicit rules or legislation. Now, at a conference here about 40 years ago, or 35 years ago, there was a discussion about should economists care about privacy. This is in the pre-digital privacy world. And there was a section of the American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings and a special issue of the Journal of Legal Studies from this Chicago conference on privacy. And the core punchline of that conference is economists shouldn't think about privacy because most standard models say information flows are good. And so restricting information flows sounds like a bad thing. And that sort of killed that literature for about 15 years. And then in the late 90s, it started to be revived again once a few other aspects of privacy were understood. Okay? And one of those things, although it hasn't been so focal, is the idea that privacy is redistributive. So privacy policy, what does it do? By definition, it restricts information flows, which generally, it's hard to think about restricting information flows as being Pareto improving. There's some exceptions, but still, it's redistributive. Some people are going to benefit more than others. And so the provision of information in the digital economy has been transformative, but it's been unequal. And these information flows, they help some, they hurt others. And so privacy policy, I'm talking about inequality, privacy policy and inequality. Privacy policy will affect inequality if the direct benefits or the negative externalities of these information flows differ across socioeconomic groups. So what I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about are a series of examples where data flows and privacy affect different socioeconomic groups differently. Okay, so I think, so there's three stages. There's one, hey, privacy is interesting. Hopefully I've convinced you that. There's two, privacy and inequality have something to do with each other, and that's what I'm going to spend the bulk of my time on. And then there's a last aspect of how do we think about market design in this context. There's been a little bit on market design and privacy, but it hasn't had this inequality angle, at least to my knowledge. So at the end, I'm going to try and bring this back to market design and think about the connection between privacy, inequality, and market design. So first, I want to think about data flows to information providers. These are sort of, think about these as advertising-supported media. Now, so Catherine and I had a study from a few years ago where we looked at the European privacy regulation. If you don't know, European regulation is much stricter than US regulation in many ways, and particularly in the context of online advertising-supported markets. And around 2004, their regulations became much stricter. Okay? So what we did is we had a data set of thousands of online ad campaigns, and we had a pretty good measure of the effectiveness of each of those campaigns. And what we showed was that, first, once they made it hard for European websites to use information, that European ad campaigns got worse. Okay? That was the explicit goal, if you think about it, of the legislation. It shouldn't have been so surprising. But at the end of the day, we found that, OK, the privacy regulation in Europe made advertising less effective in Europe. As a spin-off of this, which wasn't our core story, something that we've come back to now that we're thinking about inequality, was that different kinds of websites were affected differently. General interest websites, like news and games websites, that really, to show ads in that, they needed to know something about you to get value out of it, were hurt much more by the legislation than the specialized websites. Automotive, beauty, travel. Look, if you're on an automotive site, they know what ads to show you. We don't need any extra information. We know to show you car ads. If you're on a travel site, we know what ads to show you. Maybe not at quite the fine level that the data can help, but we know pretty much what ads to show you. But if you're on the New York Times, we have no clue what you're interested in. It's only through the use of data that we understand what you're interested in. So what does this mean? Well, OK, so we need to start with one, I guess an axiom, we'll call it that advertising to higher income people generates higher revenue. Okay, so this is just going to be a statement that I'm going to run with and state as true, and we can, I guess, go to citations and figure that out. But assuming we believe that's true, then what do restrictions on data use mean? It means that it's going to be harder for the New York Times to target those high-income people. And so the advertising in the New York Times, if they don't really know who's on that website, could become less valuable compared to advertising on sailing.com and equestrian.com, to take it to the extreme. And so what we can imagine is over time, we can see more and more revenue and more resources going to these specialized websites that serve the relatively wealthy. So here is an example where the regulation might exacerbate inequality. Now, it's not always going to work out that way. A lot of the literature, to the extent there is literature on privacy and inequality, it says individual decisions to share information may be marked by behavioral biases, leading to some optimal decisions. So Alessandro Acquisti, who has written a lot about privacy, this is his core theme. We need to think about behavioral biases in the decision to share information about ourselves. If these biases are known to firms, then those firms can manipulate consumers. They can manipulate people because they understand where you're going to make mistakes. And then if less educated people or lower income people are more susceptible to these biases, which there is some evidence to suggest, then they will be more susceptible to this manipulation by firms. So here is a situation where regulation of how firms can collect information and what they can collect could potentially alleviate issues related to inequality. So it depends. Once again, it's going to depend. So another example, regulation of data flows to goods and services providers. Okay, so when I think about the most direct way that firms are going to use data, they're going to use it to price discriminate. Okay? Information enables price discrimination. Restricting information flows is therefore likely to reduce price discrimination. Okay, another statement that this is more grounded in in my own research, so I'll trust it more, which is high-income consumers are less price sensitive, at least in consumer packaged goods. Okay? So people with higher willingness to pay will hesitate to purchase items if their purchase can be used as a signal of their higher willingness to pay for other things. Okay? So when we have this non-rival aspect of the information, what's going to happen, rich people are going to be more hesitant to buy because they're going to be afraid that that information is going to be sold to someone else who's then going to exploit them. Okay? Now, there's lots of examples of this that have shown up in the popular press. The Wall Street Journal in particular has been an advocate against this kind of thing. And it's sort of weird to think about the Wall Street Journal as an advocate, but maybe, maybe that bottom line is the reason why, which is that the Wall Street Journal reported in 2012 that Orbitz showed Mac users higher priced hotels than they showed PC users. Mac users are wealthier on average, and so Orbitz used that information. Now, it wasn't higher price for the same hotel, let's be clear, but it was, if you're a Mac user, you would get information, you would get higher priced hotels. You'd be shown higher prices. Another report also from the Wall Street Journal showed price discrimination of a variety of websites based on consumer information. The one that they picked on the most was Staples, and they showed that your online Staples prices varied based on the zip code most obviously associated with your IP address. What does that mean? If you lived in a neighborhood where offline prices were high, you would get higher online prices. It turns out at Staples, offline prices are high in wealthier neighborhoods. And so this was a situation where by using that data, they were able to charge rich people more than poor people. Okay? Now, if we regulate, we say, hey, you can't do that anymore. Maybe that's good, because maybe that's unfair or some way. But let's be clear about who it's helping and who it's hurting. Okay? On the other hand, in the insurance industry, we see something quite different in general. Here's one example. John Hancock announced an insurance discount for ratepayers that wear a Fitbit. Okay? This is, Kate was just telling me, this is an extension of the old, you get a discount for your gym membership. Okay? But now it's for a Fitbit. But these kind of benefits benefit the wealthy, right? They're more likely to adopt such technology, and in terms of fitness, they're more likely to care about a Fitbit and want it. Okay? So here's a regulation that would restrict the information flows, would alleviate inequality. Okay? Now, I should have warned you at first. I'm going to give you examples one way or the other. I don't have a unifying framework. One of the challenges I have for maybe this group is to think of a unifying framework for when different types of privacy regulation or conversely, different types of openness and information flows will help us predict when the restrictions are going to help or alleviate inequality. Alleviate or make worse inequality. So the last set of examples I want to think about are more public sector or healthcare. So this example is drawing mostly on Catherine's work with Amalia Miller from Virginia. And the first statement is that electronic medical records can improve health outcomes. And in particular, what they did is they looked at electronic medical records use by hospitals and correlated it with neonatal mortality. So in the hospitals that adopted EMR, were more or fewer babies surviving childbirth. And they showed a very strong causal link between having electronic medical records and reduced rates of neonatal death and injury. Okay? And so that paper, it's a JP paper, and they just emphasize this, hey, EMR saves babies. I think that might even be the title, something like that. Okay? And then they dig deeper and they show EMR doesn't just save babies, it saves babies for less educated, unmarried, Black and Hispanic mothers in particular. Okay? And why them? They speculate it could be one of two reasons. It could be they're not good at communicating with their physician, and so it's important that the records come in through some other source. Or it could be that the physicians are biased, and having the electronic medical record system forces them to have a standard of care across socioeconomic groups. They're indifferent to which one it is, but they say, hey, look, IT healthcare saves babies. Now, it didn't show up so much in their JP paper, but they have an earlier paper that shows on the causes of electronic medical records. Okay? And which hospitals adopt electronic medical records. This is a paper they wrote in 2009. And in that paper, they showed that privacy regulation reduces the likelihood that a hospital is going to adopt electronic medical records. Okay? And in fact, in one version of the paper, I'm not sure if it was the one that published, they used those privacy regulations as an instrument for electronic medical record use. Okay? So what does that mean? If we take that literally, it means privacy regulation reduces electronic medical records, therefore kills infants. Right? So we have, in particular, it kills infants for less educated, unmarried, black, and Hispanic mothers. So we make this connection. How do we think about privacy regulation, privacy and inequality? We have the healthcare privacy regulation that directly hurts lower socioeconomic groups. Now, one last example, which I thought of just quite recently, because I was teaching an executive program for members of the Ontario government, and they were frustrated with the census data they could get. They said, we have great data for Toronto and Ottawa, the two biggest cities in Ontario, and we have terrible data for the rest of the province. Why do they have terrible data for the rest of the province? It's because the way the census gives out data, the way Statistics Canada gives out data is if you have a high population in your county, they're willing to give you really rich data by demographic, by education, by income, by first language. But if you're in a place that only has 500 people, they're not willing to split it up. So that meant that their policies were very good for Toronto. Like, think about who needs English as a second language instruction. In Toronto, they had a pretty good sense of how many people in Toronto needed English as a second language instruction because that was a census question, and they could directly interpret it. But in rural Ontario, or even in medium-sized cities, there weren't enough people who spoke Tamil at home that they knew that they needed a resource, that they knew that they needed to put their resources there. So policy was worse in rural areas, which tend to be poorer, explicitly because of the privacy regulation in protecting people's information they give to the census. So, okay, so this is all a way of saying that privacy regulation can exacerbate or alleviate inequality. And it's not obvious to me ex ante based on, you can think it through at the example level, but I don't know of a unifying framework, and I didn't think of one since I've been asked to write this panel. Okay, so something you should know about privacy regulation. There's currently two broad ways to think about how we should regulate privacy. There's a US approach, which is sectoral. There's different laws for financial services, credit reporting, cable TV, health, etc. Video stores, libraries, whatever. And some of these, in fact, are stricter than Europe. And in some cases, it's much less strict than Europe. So the statement that Europe is stricter isn't quite true, because in cable television, for bizarre reasons, and in video stores, for even more bizarre reasons, the United States has very strict privacy regulation. Okay. Europe has an omnibus approach where the same regulation applies to all types of personal data. And the advocates like the omnibus approach because it sounds omnibus, right? It's everything. So if you're a privacy advocate, you say, we want, it's a fundamental right to privacy. We want something more complete because it better protects the vulnerable. I take issue. I think, hopefully, the examples I've shown argue at least for a benefit of the sectoral approach. How to think about this regulation isn't obvious to me, but at least we can say, hey, maybe thinking about this, there's going to be different consequences across sector, especially if we care about inequality, is going to be important. There's heterogeneity across contexts is particularly relevant here. It might sometimes enable vulnerable populations to pay lower prices. It might lead to exploitation by firms. We need to think about the context in order to understand when we should restrict information flows and when we shouldn't, especially if we care about these issues related to inequality. And so a one-size-fits-all approach might end up exacerbating inequality accidentally because the price discrimination stuff dominates the insurance side. So what are the open research questions? I think pretty much everything is an open research question. We have some understanding of the economics of privacy. There was just a great Journal of Economic Literature article that came out on the economics of privacy. It does not talk about inequality, and it barely touches on market design. So given that privacy policy is redistributive, we need to think about models that help inform us. We need something, a unifying framework, I said that, but maybe, I think most interestingly, what does market-focused regulation look like in the context of data? What does a market for data look like in the context of this non-rival good, where in certain situations it can make, hurt people in low socioeconomic status, and in other situations it can benefit? And can we design these markets of information to alleviate rather than exacerbate inequality? So that's what I had to say.